Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi yassir wa a'in ya kareem, waftah bil haqqi innaka al-fatahul alim. I was having a go earlier today at this idea of ta'allum, the acquisition of knowledge, education, as not being categorically different to any other form of taqarrub or approach to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, it's min jumlatil ibadat. It's one of the forms of worship. Ibadah is in fact rather a lousy translation for worship, or vice versa, if you like. It's a different kind of concept because it's related, as we know, to the root abd, the Adamic human being. Is in the state of ubudiyyah, slavehood. This is the position of sajda. This is the maqam of the prophets. Sayyidina Isa, despite all that was said about him and about his exalted status, the first thing he says when coming into the dunya is, Inni Abdullah. I am Allah's slave. Atani al-kitaba. He gave me the book. In other words, he taught me. So the station of ubudiyyah and the station of ta'allum are not separable. You cannot be an abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless you know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at some level. Allah says, إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء. Allah is only feared by the ulama, the learned amongst His ibad, His slaves. True khashya, which is a form of taqwa, true fear, is only possible when we know exactly what we are fearing, who we are fearing, and how to fear Him. So, one way, as we saw this morning, of making our ta'allum a form of ibadah is to acquire the prophetic ability of naming with the names, giving to the phenomena of created existence those names and those meanings which have been truly attributed to them by the Creator. And these names are from tawqif, they are divinely bestowed. They are not from wada' or human invention. And we have an entire very sophisticated branch of the Islamic sciences called fiqh al-lugha, which goes into the metaphysical significations of the process of naming. If you look at the first section of Imam al-Ghazali's book Al-Maqsad al-Asna fi Sharh Ma'ani Asma'illah al-Husna, which has been done into English once or twice, you'll see exactly how important and sophisticated this science is. So as we learn, we become Adamic. We acquire or we reacquire Sayyidina Adam's knowledge of the world. And this also must mean that there is a knowledge that is true, the Adamic knowledge, and there is also a bogus knowledge. The names which were taught to Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam in that great cosmic event, which is the precedent for all Islamic learning, were correct names. They indicate what is the case with regard to each of the events which they signify. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives His creature the true name of everything. Human beings, Adam on their own authority, on our own authority, cannot know the true names of the phenomena of created existence. As we saw earlier, we as creatures cannot reach outside the realm of creation. The Creator subhanahu wa ta'ala has to intervene if we are to have that sort of knowledge. So these names, which are the basis of all processes of education, have to come from outside. So we human beings just have to invent names when we need a name for something, if we don't have a revealed name. And to invent a name is, in a sense, to set up an idol. Could be one definition of idolatry. Allah says, "In hiya illa asma'." They are but names. سَمَّيْتُمُوهَا أَنْتُمْ وَآبَاؤُكُمْ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ بِهَا مِنْ سُلْطَانٍ. They are but names which you and your forefathers have invented, concocted. Allah has sent down no authority regarding them. This is to do with the idols, the asnam of the pagan Quraysh, but in this deep Islamic understanding we could say that it relates to any attempt by human beings to attribute a name on human authority to any phenomenon of existence. The name has to come from the divine authorization. Why should this be? Well, to name a thing is implicitly to declare a belief about its source. When we use an Islamic name for a phenomenon, one which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has himself used and sanctioned in scripture, we are acknowledging that phenomenon's absolute dependence upon him. He is al-Qahhar, the compeller. This is one of his names. Everything in existence is determined at all moments by his relation to it. That's the only real relation. When we make up a name, we are attributing that phenomenon to ourselves, and hence we are usurping a divine prerogative. Hence we could define the difference between Islamic education and modern secular education as the difference between a system that recognizes Tawheed in the most profound sense, Tawheed as the reduction of all manifest apparent being to its divine metaphysical source in his knowledge. On the one hand, Islamic education, which is the reduction of everything to the one principle, and on the other hand, a system that denies Tawheed, that, as we saw, is preoccupied with the signposts, neglects where they are all pointing. A system that neglects or even negates the wisdom that all phenomena are from one transcendent source. In other words, it is a system of shirk. So these two surviving systems of education in our world represent two polar opposites. The prophetic reduction of all things to the one, and the demonic diversification of phenomena and the absolutizing of the infinite. In other words, infinite possibility, infinite forms. The idea that the universe is not bounded. In other words, infinity, absoluteness, which was by all traditional civilizations taken to be an attribute of the source, of Allah, has now been taken away from the source and has been applied to the world of forms. So the world itself becomes the absolute, and the absolute with a capital A is no longer acknowledged. So this is the gulf that separates our model of education from the only significant alternative. Now it's a large judgment, but Islam, I think, has to be insistent here. We are dealing with alternatives of Tawheed and Shirk. The basis of our system of education is Tawheed. The basis of their system of education is fundamentally an assumption of Shirk. To affirm a plurality of causes in the cosmos is Shirk. An idol doesn't have to be thought of as a conscious being in order to be an idol. Sin, really, of modern educationalists and of the Western approach to knowledge generally, is, again, as we saw, the sin of Shaitan, of Iblis, who refused to bow down to Adam. I'm better than him, he said. You've created me of fire. وَخَلَقْتَهُ مِنْ طِينٍ. You created him of clay. Introduction of a plurality of axiologies, of scales of judgment. That is shirk. And that's the nature of modern education. Now, by names, asma', this Quranic term, we mean, of course, not just the linguistic terms for the phenomena of sensed existence, this complex of perceived phenomena into which we've been put, but also their values and their attribution. For a Muslim to give something its name, its true name, is to affirm its correct relationship to its maker and to the created order. Hence, when the human creature, as Khalifa, attributes names to phenomena, metaphor for the whole process of education, the Khalifa thereby affirms his correct relationship to the rest of creation and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the hierarchy of the knowledges. So when a Muslim, for instance, to take a practical example, refers to warfare as jihad, he or she immediately implies and accepts a framework of revealed morality that relates the event to Allah. When the kafir speaks of war using human language, or when he or she speaks of guerre or krieg or savage or whatever, he or she is accepting, by using that term, a non-revealed man-made system of values. Now the Muslim, by using the names which are the conceptual categories which revelation grants to us for application to ourselves and to the world, is connected to and affirms again the primordial covenant of Alastu bi Rabbikum. And we could say that the core of all of these names, and hence the essence of the Islamic understanding of education, and the core of their acquisition, their learning, and their application to make sense of the world around us, is remembering that primordial moment, remembering the One Himself, the source of our being, without whose light we ourselves as shadows could not even momentarily exist. So the first step of Islamic education has to be that knowledge, taking it right back to our first moment as conscious differentiated beings on the day of Alastu bi Rabbikum. That's the first ingredient in our humanity. And the ulama have agreed upon this. This is the first thing that we must do. We must know. Unless we know, with a capital N, where we come from, the first principle of Tawheed, no other knowledge can be anything other than the affirmation of a plurality, of the absolutizing of multiplicity, and hence a form of shirk. So Imam al-Laqani, for instance, says, وَاجْزِمْ بِأَنَّ أَوَّلًا مِمَّا يَجِبْ مَعْرِفَةٌ وَفِيهِ خُلْفٌ مُنْتَصِبٌ. Be certain, know for sure, that the first obligation is knowledge. And concerning this, there are different opinions amongst the ulama. In other words, knowledge of what precisely, but knowledge, the first obligation. Jalaluddin Rumi, again, if I can cite him, puts it this way. It's quite a long, I think, very beautiful quote from him, which really sums up what I'm getting at. There is one thing in this world which must never be forgotten. If you forget everything else but not this one thing, then in the end you may have no fear. But if you carry out and remember all things except this one thing, you have done nothing at all. There's a difference between the believer and the unbeliever. The unbeliever knows everything except the indispensable, and hence his knowledge is ashes, blown about by the wind, like his actions, no better than his actions. And yet the Muslim, however muqassir, however great may be his shortcomings, nonetheless, if he holds firmly, sincerely to that awareness of where he comes from and of the underlying unity of the world, of the source of the world, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. No fear, no grief. And then Imam Jalaluddin Rumi, Qaddasallahu sirrahu, goes on to say, he quotes, Allah says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam. We have ennobled the children of Adam. And he says, Allah did not say we have ennobled the heavens and the earth. So man is able to perform that task which the heavens and the earth, the mountains, are not able to perform. Famous Quranic image. And when man performs that task, he will no longer be zaluman jahula, unjust, very foolish. This is the verse that begins, Inna aradna al-amanata ala samawati wal-ardi wal-jibali. We offered the amana, the trust, to the heavens and the earth and the mountains. فَأَشْفَقْنَا مِنْهَا. And they were afraid of this amana. But who carried it? فَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانِ. Human being carried it, this trust. إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Truly he was ever unjust, unbalanced, ignorant. Then he goes on to say, this is Imam Jalaluddin, if you say, though I do not perform that task, holding the amana, which is knowledge of Allah and Tawheed, and hence becoming the Khalifa in the earth, though I don't perform that task, I perform so many other tasks. This is the claim of modern man. Then know that man was not created for those other tasks. It is just as if you took a priceless sword of Indian steel, like those found in the treasuries of kings, and made of it a cleaver for rotten meat, saying, I'm not letting this sword stand idle. I perform so many useful tasks with it. Or if you were to take a golden bowl and cook turnips in it, whereas for a single grain of that gold you could buy 100 pots. Or you have made a knife of pure Damascus ware into a nail on which to hang a broken gourd, saying, I'm making good use of this thing. I hang a gourd on it. I'm not letting that blade go to waste. But that's exactly what we are doing with ourselves, with our minds, our spirits and our bodies, if we preoccupy ourselves with the endless smaller knowledges, the tafasil of creation, and ignore what is fundamental, which is the meaning and the source of all of those knowledges. Now, man, the human creature, is bound by this primordial mithaq, this covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we shall and must remember. So we can say that our Islam, our submission to Allah, is part of our fitrah because it predates our birth. It's the meaning of the fitrah. However, it is also part of our innate temper that we forget. We're not just rememberers, we are also forgetters. Ibn Abbas used to say, إِنَّمَا سُمِّيَ الْإِنسَانُ إِنسَانًا لِأَنَّهُ عُهِدَ إِلَيْهِ فَنَسِي. Man is only called insan because he was entrusted with a pledge and then forgot. One of the derivations of the word insan, which means man, and this is inclusive of women, the human being, if you like, is that it is related to the Arabic word nisyan, which means forgetfulness, and that defines our nature, if you like, as human beings. The animals really can't forget because they don't remember as we do. They just follow their fitrah and their ghariza, their instincts and their temperament. The angels certainly can't forget, but human beings can forget. So for Ibn Abbas, that's the meaning of the name of our species. We're the forgetters. Homo, whatever the word would be in Latin. Now, the product of this process of education is the rememberer, the dhakir, and the dhakir is also the mudhakkir, because it is not enough to remember. So tremendous is the knowledge that is being remembered that we must convey it to others. And this is part of the sunnah as well, because we follow him not just in what he called us to, but in the process of calling as well. Da'wah is part of the sunnah. Every Muslim must be a da'iyah. So the Khalifa is the one who upholds justice in the most profound sense of, through his education, knowing his place in the universe, knowing what are the bounds of correct human behavior for men and for women, so that the entire cosmic balance will not be disrupted, so that man can develop his true status as abd, as slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this khilafah is not just in social relations, but exists within the self. And the khilafah exists in a sense to the self as well, because the khalifa, the divinely authorized ruler, does not just rule in the world and rule society, but it also refers to our ruling of ourselves as human composites on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has an inward or a personal as well as a public dimension. I have a quote here from the modern Malaysian theologian Sayyid Naqib al-Attas. He says, I think quite beautifully, the concept of justice in Islam does not only refer to relational situations of harmony and equilibrium existing between one person and another, or between the society and the state, or between the ruler and his subjects. That's a contemporary Muslim activist's definition, perhaps. But he says no, that true concept of justice in Islam, in other words, the man of Khilafah, far more profoundly and fundamentally, it refers in a primary way to the harmonious and right balanced relationship existing between man and his self. That's the true nature of Khilafah. And the Khalifa can only put everything in its proper place in the world which he governs if he or she is putting everything within him or herself in the proper place. Nowadays we tend to invert that, probably because of secular influences, Marxism in particular, and most of the secular liberationisms of the last 150 years have said that the alienations within the human soul, our sense of stress, of alienation from each other, from our true selves, come about because of alienations in society. And if you put right the ills that are in society, the human soul will be healed. That's a total inversion of the traditional religious understanding, which is the other way around. لا يغير الله ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in their selves, or in their nafs, their anfus. So the creation of khilafah in the world begins with the creation of khilafah in the soul. When we are ourselves harmonious, prophetically guided, Adamic individuals, then inevitably Allah will bring about a harmonization of the world around us. Never the other way around. So we could say that in Islam, very radically from a modern secular perspective, and certainly from the point of view of modern philosophers of education, there is no social contract. I don't really believe in a social contract and Thomas Paine and the rights of man and Bentham and utilitarian ideas of society and the meaning of citizenship. We don't believe that that works terribly well, and we don't believe that it's theologically valid. We have only one contract. The contract is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our duties are to Him. There are huquq al-ibad and there is huquq Allah. But the huquq al-ibad are very contingent and only have meaning, real value and content, because of the much more significant responsibility that we have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another major difference between Islamic education and modern Western education: we aren't really educating citizens, we are educating ibad. Good family relations, good relations between neighbors, harmonious relations between the races and the sexes and nations come about once that fundamental relationship is established. That's the basis for everything else. And if you don't have that relationship, nothing else is going to work. The environment, another case in point. It is only when we are at peace with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we can be at peace with the environment. Otherwise we will always view it rapaciously. And the modern environmentalist programs are always doomed to failure because they have no real sense of who made the environment, what it's for, what our place in it might be. Best we can do is to treat other orders of creation as sort of pets or oddities. But we can never respect them truly as other levels of Allah's creation, each one of which knows its salat and its tasbih, unless we know where it's all from. Now, this khilafah that comes about, or has to come about, within the human self differs radically from any modern Western image of human psychology, in that it affirms that not only do we have a self, but we have a soul. or perhaps to use slightly clearer vocabulary, not only do we have a self, but we have a spirit. There is nafs, which is the self. There is ruh, which is the spirit. Now the nafs can never be done away with, because it is the self, and you can't lose yourself while remaining possessed of an identity. The nafs is very elusive. One of the hardest subjects in traditional Islam is talk about the self, because it's hard for an entity to perceive itself. One reason why you need a teacher, a mirror. But the Qur'an makes it quite clear that there are different degrees of the soul. The context for the full exposition of this would be elsewhere, but briefly it speaks of an-nafs al-ammara bis-su', the self that commands evil, that is to say, the passional self, that which is unrestrained by any intuitive knowledge of the virtues derived from the fitrah, or any explicit knowledge of the virtues derived from a written revelation. And it just craves immediate gratification and pays no attention to the debased consequences of that. We could say that modern society is based on the glorification of that nafs. The only limit being where the nafs is right to self-gratification clashes with some other nafs's right to self-gratification. And that's the basis of the Western social contract. And that's really all that people now believe in. That's the sum total of modern education. That, yeah, the world is the here and now, it is all that exists, the body is the absolute. Human fulfillment and satisfaction comes about through maximizing sense gratification and self-esteem. Go through life acquiring experiences, so that at the end of your life you can look back on a kind of stamp collection of interesting experiences that you've picked up from here and there. The only rule is, don't get in the way of other people's right to do the same thing. Don't do that, but anything else that's halal for you. And that's the only real sharia, the only moral absolute that the modern world still is concerned with. And modern discourses on human rights, for the most part, no more than just that. Don't get in the way of other people's lower desires. Now there are higher aspects of the self as well, which have not been entirely forgotten, even by many people in the modern world. Because we are of the fitrah, people do have a sense of natural knowledge. And there is a nafs al-lawwama, another Quranic term, the guilt-ridden soul, the soul that blames itself perpetually. Lawwama is an emphatic form. And this is where we are still following the desires of this lower self for immediate gratification of animal desires, which are not just to do with the senses but also to do with ego, with self-esteem, because the animals have a sense of ego and self-respect, just as human beings do. It's not just about lust and gluttony. But afterwards we feel a little bit degraded by the experience. That's a nafs al-lawwama. This is the condition of most humanity, in the past as in the present. And the final degree is an-nafs al-mutma'inna. And this is the degree that is hardly ever reached in our stress-ridden world. Despite the endlessly repeated claim of modernity to bring about human happiness, the reality seems to be quite otherwise. The oldest cliche in the preacher's vocabulary is that material pleasures do not bring about happiness. People more or less know that, but what else do they have? So they run after them. But the soul at peace, which is the Adamic soul, the soul that has turned around and has seen the light, where is that in our age? Can modernity produce it? Modernity produces people who yearn for it. The religions, new religions, older religions, are still in business. But where is the saint? What is the performative nature of the traditional religions and the new religious movements? Are they really producing awliya? Is the style of education that they commend actually working in producing really transformed human beings? In the case of Protestantism, certainly not, because one of the founding principles of Protestantism that there really are no saints. A person who is close to God is a person who is morally good, and who is in Christ, who is following the scriptures. But the traditional Christian idea of sainthood, a person of infinite goodness, a miracle worker, whose blessings may continue even after his or her death, Protestants explicitly swept that away, and that was one major step by which Europe became secularized. The sacred in human form was abolished. In some circles in the Islamic world today there is a comparable Protestant move. Get back to the scriptures, be a moral person, obey all of the rules, and that's wilayah. That's all that the Qur'an and the Hadith are requiring of you. Nothing higher, nothing more impressive. Just be a good boy and you'll go to heaven. Which from the perspective of all traditional religion is an appalling debasement. It may be as well here to cite the great hadith of wilayah, and when we speak about education in Islam, this is our objective, because this wilayah is none other than the Adamic state of khilafah. There's no difference. Perfection is perfection. And this is the great hadith Qudsi, narrated by Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu in Bukhari. أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال فيما يرويه عن ربه جل وعلا من آذى لي وليا فقد آذنته بالحرب. This is the great momentous prophetic definition of who is this perfected human being, who is this wali, the educated person. And in this hadith Qudsi, Allah is telling us, whoever makes war on a wali of mine, I declare war on him. So watch out. وَلَا يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُهُ عَلَيْهِ. Hadith goes on to say, and describing here the maratib as-suluk, the stages of wayfaring, the fruits of education, if you like, says, my slave draws near to me with nothing more beloved to me than that which I have made obligatory upon him. In other words, at this beginning stage of Islamic education, the object of Allah's love is the fara'id, the obligations. Allah loves the salat, the siyam, because these are the instruments by which human beings achieve taqarrub, draw near to Him. And then the register of this hadith Qudsi subtly shifts. وَلَا يَزَالُ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أُحِبَّهُ. And my slave, remember the abd, it's the glorious description of the human wayfarer here. My slave continues to draw closer to me through nawafil, optional acts of devotion, until I love him. So at the second stage, the love is not for the ibadat, for the fara'id, the love is for the one who is practicing those practices. The salik, the abd. This is the maqam of mahabba, and all authentic religion has this emotion close to its heart. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, his title in the hadith is Habibullah. All of the prophets, the great prophets in the sound hadith, are given names. Sayyidina Musa is Kalimullah. Sayyidina Nuh is Najiyullah, the one saved by Allah. Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam is Ruhullah, Spirit of Allah. Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is Khalilullah, the intimate of Allah. What is the title of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam? It's Habibullah, the beloved of Allah, and this is an indication of his state through this taraqqi, this process of growth, of inward education, to this great state of mahabba, which is the condition of the wali. Because the Qur'an itself says, Inna awliya Allahi la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. Allah's awliya, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. You've heard this definition before. That is what a wali is. And it's the opposite of our condition as modern Muslims. We're full of fear and we're full of grief. We're terrified of America and we're terrified of the Israelis and the Indian government and the economic system and global debt and God knows what. It's not the way of the Sahaba and it's not the way of the wali. He is not afraid except of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he knows that Allah is the one with the names, the one who is the true agent in the cosmos. But to the extent that we are uneducated, we forget that. We move away from khilafah, we move away from wilayah, and we get scared. Because we think that those things truly have the power to hurt us. It's not the case. No khawf. One of the early Sufis, al-Allama al-Shibli, radiallahu anhu, was once by an unjust ruler thrown to the lions, to the extent that a lion took his head in the lion's mouth. It was Allah's decree that the saint should be saved, and afterwards he was asked, Ya Shaykh, what were you thinking about when your head was in the lion's mouth? And he said, I was trying to remember the Sharia ruling on the purity of lion saliva. That's what he was worried about. He was worried about continuing to follow the Sharia to the end, and Allah would look after everything else. That was his fear. His fear was only for violating the Sharia, not for any phenomenon in Allah's creation. If Allah wished to take his soul, that was Allah's decree, and he had rida, state of serene, trusting acceptance of Allah's decree, which used to be the watchword of the Muslim world. Remember the old idea of oriental repose, fatalism, those not quite accurate characterizations that 19th century travelers applied to our societies. We were the people of tawakkul and the people of rida. We were not afraid of anything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, and they don't grieve. In other words, in their lack of khawf, they declare their knowledge that the future is in Allah's hands. Khawf is about what might happen, it's about the future. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, and they declare by not grieving that the past is in Allah's hands as well, because huzn is for what has happened in the past. So future and past, it's all in Allah's hands because He is the omnipotent. We believe in an omnipotent God, and that's the state of the wali. He knows everything is in good hands. Nowadays, Allahu A'lam, hardly any ummah seems to have more khawf and more huzn than the ummah of Islam. This kind of panic seems to have set in. Everybody's ganging up on us. Paranoia. This has nothing to do with the spirit of Islam, and it's an impugning of the very principle of tawheed. We should be the ummah of tawakkul. Of all peoples, we should know that history is in good hands and that we have nothing to worry about. We have nothing to worry about. Except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our relationship with Him. We should look to our tahara, we should look to our ibadah, we should look to fulfilling all of those aspects of Sharia which it is humanly possible for us to operationalize in our context, but we should not be worrying about global Masonic conspiracies and threats of this, that and the other kind, because that's chimera, that's part of the zulumat, the shadows, has no reality, it has no energy, no inertia of its own whatsoever. Dynamic principle of the cosmos is exclusively divine providence. Amazing that we should have lost sight of this, but the Ummah is becoming an Ummah of jaza', of panic. To get back to the Hadith Qudsi, فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُهُ, Allah is saying, and when I have loved him, the wali, كُنْتُ سَمْعَهُ الَّذِي يَسْمَعُ بِهِ, I become the hearing with which he hears, وَبَصَرَهُ الَّذِي يُبْصِرُ بِهِ, the sight with which he sees, وَيَدَهُ الَّتِي يَبْطِشُ بِهَا, and the hand with which he strikes, وَرِجْلَهُ الَّتِي يَمْشِي عَلَيْهَا, and the foot upon which he walks, وَلَئِنِ اسْتَنْصَرَنِي لَأَنْصُرَنَّ وَلَئِنِ اسْتَعَاذَ بِي لَأُعِيذَنَّ, and if he seeks victory from me, I shall surely grant him victory, and if he seeks my protection, I shall surely grant him protection. Again, an allusion to the future and to the past, the maqams of khawf and huzn, which are to be moved beyond. Because if the wali prays for victory, لَأَنْصُرَنَّ, this is the emphatic form of the Arabic, I shall surely grant him victory, and this is the secret of the victories incomprehensible to the secular historian that were granted to the Sahaba. If you look at their achievement, there is no social science on earth that can explain that achievement. It is entirely miraculous. And the Sahaba, when they set off on those extraordinary adventures, did not say, well, the Byzantines are strong and the Sassanids are strong and maybe we're at danger. They didn't think in those terms at all. And Allah gives them the victory, the most improbable conquest in history. The most people who had historically been the most divided, warring amongst themselves, with no history of law and of government amongst themselves, immediately become the rulers of the entire ancient world. That was because of those people were awliya, as defined by this hadith. Allah's promise is here. I will give you victory if you seek victory from me. And if you seek protection from me, I will give you protection. Now this hadith really encompasses the remedy for the problems of the Muslim Ummah. The fara'id, get those right. The nawafil, get those right, really right, and then you will be in this maqam of mahabba, in the joyous, loving relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything else sorts itself out, and you'll see that all of the apparent difficulties and obstacles in the world are illusions, shadows compared to the power of Allah. But somehow we have gone down the modern path of attributing real power, real hawl and real quwwah to what is other than Allah. It's not the way of tawheed. Tawheed, when truly internalizes, brings about a sense of absolute serenity, and that's why it's referred to as an-nafs al-mutma'inna, the soul at peace. The final solution to all problems of stress, nervousness, agitation, only be found in remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that He is one. بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, by His remembrance hearts are made tranquil, by nothing else. Everything else in the dunya is tugging at you and tugging against each other. It's a web of tensions and rivalries. Peace, sakina, is only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The nearer you get to the center, the more harmony there is. Go to the periphery, to maximum multiplicity and plurality, and there is only strife, rivalry, warfare, disharmony. So Islamic education, in its most profound aspect, is about equipping us to undertake this journey, which is the journey by which the self is transformed. And it is not a process of negation, it's a process of uncovering. Because the lower aspects of the soul are conditioned by our bad experiences in the world, poor upbringing. They are not from the fitrah. The fitrah is essentially something that is good. And what we came with into the world was not all of these complexes and memories and insecurities that now shape us. What we came with into the world was the ruh, the purity, the absolute wide-eyed optimistic innocence of the baby. We need to become like that again, to have faces as luminous and as pure and as good as the face of the baby. The face of the saint, the face of the prophet, is of course a face of experience and wisdom and knowledge, but it is also that luminosity that shines from the brow of the newly born infant. Absence of guilt, absence of sin. I've always been amazed at the Catholic understanding of original sin that holds that the baby, when still unbaptized, is destined for eternal punishment. Until very recently in the Catholic Church it was thought that if a baby died before being baptized, it could never get to heaven and would be punished eternally. Why? Because it's still responsible for the sin of Adam. In the Middle Ages, a pregnant woman who died was not allowed to have a funeral in a church. Her body had to wait outside the door of the church because she carried within her womb unregenerate humanity, a cursed piece of flesh, carrying the stain of original sin not washed away by the sacrament of baptism. So such women, pregnant women who died, were not allowed into church. It's a pretty ferocious view of the human condition, and one that is really the polar opposite of our own. If you want to know why secularity and the rejection of religion developed in the Western world rather than Islam, look at things like that. Very degraded, dark image of humanity. And the face of the baby, on their view, should be something demonic, monstrous. But no, it isn't. It is what we would expect as Muslims. It's something marvelous. As they say in Egypt, when they look at a baby, Lessa gadid min al-Jannah, it's new from paradise. It's just come from on high. So this is our task. The task is not to get rid of our true natures, but to wash out those stables that have accumulated all manner of filth through the years of our existence in the world, to rediscover what we are really supposed to be, which is the khulafa. And the adult can be an actualized khalifa in the sense that a baby can't, because a baby has no tasrif, has no capacity to control itself or others, and is hence khalifa only in a latent sense. The superiority of the saint and the prophet over the innocent baby is a categoric superiority because of education, because of knowledge, because of experience. Now, let me talk a little bit about the understanding that traditional Islam has had, and here we are talking not about a kind of newfangled Islam that trusts our own fallible, time-bound prejudices to interpret the Qur'an and the Hadith, but that is based on the accumulated wisdom and reflection and discussion over centuries of thousands of transformed souls. And everything I'm going to say in these sessions is based on the expectation that we recognize that the ulama know the Qur'an and the Sunnah better than we do. Another sign of the dispersal and confusion of the modern Muslim mentality and our initiation into the logic of multiplicity is that we are now trusting ourselves, and we say Qur'an and Sunnah, Qur'an and Sunnah, neglecting the fact that the Qur'an and the Sunnah always has an interpreter. And that interpreter can either be ourselves, or it can be the consensus of thousands upon thousands of great transformed souls. People who know the Qur'an and the Sunnah outwardly and inwardly better than we ever will. So I would say that it is a form of implicit shirk to say, I'm going to bypass the tradition and go directly to the sources, Qur'an and Sunnah, because it is to set up one's own judgment as being superior to the judgment of all of those others, which is an absurdity. It's probably the greatest, most pernicious error in the modern Ummah to say, well, 100,000 Shafi'i ulama might have come to this position, and I'm not really going to trouble myself to read all of the thousands of books through which this position was negotiated and arrived at. I'm going to say I know better. That really is a form of pharaonic arrogance. This is not a minor error, a minor slip in our understanding of how Islamic education should take place. It's a very fundamental error. It's a Protestant error, if you like. The idea that our personal consciences are so refined and so pure that we can understand the scriptures better than earlier generations, whole armies of great purified souls. It's an absurdity. It's a form of arrogance. It's also a form of backbiting to say that the ulama simply got it wrong and that we're going to get it right. This is probably the greatest act of collective backbiting in the history of the Ummah. We should be eating the dead flesh of deceased ulama, saying that they got it wrong. They were people of taqleed, they were Ash'aris, they were Hanafis, they were whatever, and we can get it right. That's backbiting. So what I'm going to say is going to be based on the certainty that our minds are infinitely more fallible than the minds of past generations of great ulama. And those ulama, historically, looking at processes of education, have held that there are two kinds of knowledge. There are many ways of dividing the knowledges in Islam, but perhaps the most fundamental, and the only one which I have time to speak of now, is the distinction between the knowledge that serves the soul and the knowledge that serves the body. These are two interactive entities, as we've already seen. Now, the knowledge that sustains the soul has only one source, which is revelation. Because the soul, or the spirit, if you like, is not of this world. Because it's immortal, it partakes of infinity. Nothing in the material world partakes in infinity. So we can say that that spark which is at the center of the human creature is not of this world. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, the Qur'an says, they ask you about the ruh. قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, say the ruh, the spirit, is of the command of my Lord, or the affair of my Lord. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا, and of knowledge you have been given but little. So it's of the affair or the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that which sustains it in this world cannot be a logic which is derived from the logic of the world. That's why we need revelation, basically. Other aspects of human ma'ash, human welfare, can be worked out from the data of the senses and inference from the phenomena of the natural world. But when we talk about the sciences of the soul, we are talking about sciences that must have a celestial divine origin. Of course, the revelation in our case is the Qur'an, the Sunnah being, in this sense, its interpretation, modelled by the one who was himself the most perfect example of human education, the one educated by his Lord, the educator, in the name of his Lord sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I think at this point, because there is more that I want to say, and as I understand it, it's time for the adhan of Maghrib, I will break off. I don't think I need to apologize for dealing with this subject in some detail, because I think if we understand it properly, we can strengthen our niyyah. And the niyyah, when we acquire the Islamic knowledges, should be a very clear niyyah, not just sincere, but also articulate. We need to know exactly what knowledge is. what it's for, where it can take us, and what is the distinction between useful knowledge and useless knowledge, and what is the distinction between true knowledge and bogus knowledge. So I hope that what I've said has been at least a move in that direction. And inshallah, after the prayer, we'll have an opportunity to look into the way in which Islamic civilization, the consensus of the ulama, has traditionally carried out the division of the sciences in a little bit more detail. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi ta'ala rabbil alameen. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wa mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. If I can take the opportunity to insert here a brief commercial break to inspire you to pay vast sums of money for my latest booklet. One of the hadiths in Bukhari, which Imam Ibn Hajar comments on in this selection, is the hadith al-Nawafil, which I was speaking about a few moments ago. And I think it's because of the possibility, however remote, of a misunderstanding through excessive literalness of this hadith Qudsi. It's useful to reflect on the various meanings that he offers. I'll read part of this, and you can read the rest. This is where he says, and when I love him, I am his ear with which he hears, his sight with which he sees, etc. Here the problem arises of how the Creator can be a slave's hearing and sight and so on. The answer has several aspects. Firstly, the meaning is, I am his hearing and his sight in his choosing my command, so that he loves my obedience and prefers my service. Secondly, the meaning is, his whole being is occupied with me, so that he listens with his hearing only to what pleases me, and sees with his eye only that which I have commanded him to behold. And he gives another 4 different interpretations from different ulama. He also explains the meaning that some of the later Sufis have discovered in the hadith. He says, some of the later Sufis apply it to the spiritual degrees, the maqams of annihilation and obliteration. This is fana or mahu. These being the utmost point beyond which is the void. In this station, the Muslim is established by God's establishing him. He loves through God's love for him. He sees through his sight of him, without there remaining with him anything to which a name could be attached or which relates to any matter or can be characterized by any predicate. The meaning of the discourse is that he witnesses Allah's establishment of him so that he is established, Allah's love of him so that he loves him, and his sight of him so that he comes looking to him with his heart. And then he closes by saying, in none of these interpretations is there any scope for the believers in ittihad, or those who believe in absolute unity, al-wahdat al-mutlaqa, since he says in the remainder of the hadith, if he asks me, I shall surely grant him his request. If he seeks my protection, I shall surely grant him protection. In other words, the human subject still exists. This is not an annihilation of the human subject. Imam Ibn Hajar, a great lover of the Sufis, as is evident throughout his great commentary on Bukhari, is here drawing our attention to the negation by the Sufis of any literalist reading of this hadith that might lead us to the heretical belief in ittihad. That is to say, the uniting of the human being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is impossible. Two essences, a finite and an infinite, cannot coalesce into a single essence. It's logically impossible. Theologically impossible. Impugns the very principle of tawheed. Anyway, you can read the rest of that at your leisure. I think it's an important parenthetical comment. What I want to do now is to talk about this dichotomizing that the ulama came up with when looking at the different kinds of ulum. Eventually, as we'll see, they divided knowledges into many hundreds of types. But the two fundamental types, which certainly appear in Ghazali's differentiation are knowledges that sustain the soul and knowledges that sustain the body. And we saw that the former has only one source, namely revelation, and the second can have material sources, sensory sources. Now, this second category, the sustenance of the body, these are the practical material sciences. Nowadays, what goes by the name of ulum. These are acquired through methods of research, experimentation, empirical observation of the dunya. So the first is, as it were, from the top down. That's why it's superior. And the second is from the bottom up. You deduce the abstractions of this science by looking at the differentiations of the world. But the science of the soul comes from above. The ulama also say that the first is a fard ayn and the second is a fard kifaya. In other words, it's an obligation on every believer to know, to be educated about the states of the soul, because it is upon that our salvation depends. But it is not a fard ayn, or an obligation upon every believer to know about medicine or engineering or computer programming or whatever it might be. These can still be useful sciences, but it's not incumbent religiously upon every Muslim to master them. There's also a distinction that you'll find in the work of Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, where he identifies three different kinds of knowledge. Not two different kinds, which is more of an Ash'ari dichotomy, but the Maturidis typically identify three types of knowledge. Firstly, there is knowledge through sense perception, ayan. I know that the moon is shining because my sense of sight tells me that. That's a form of knowledge. Another is inductive knowledge from reasoning, what is known as nazar, through processes of logical induction from first principles. And the science of logic, or mantiq, very highly developed in classical Islam, one of the essential ulum. And the third type in this Maturidi classification is reports from revelation, which they call akhbar. Now, picking up these distinctions and running with them, the classical ulama developed a number of different ways of subdividing the ulum. And these subcategories formed the basis for the curricula that were followed in classical Muslim madrassahs. Sometimes we will find that the category of empirical knowledge is subdivided into three different ulum, all of which are regarded as useful sciences: mathematics, physics, and metaphysics. But generally, in later Islamic civilization, we find that the term used, or the differentiation uses the terms ulum aqliya and ulum naqliya. This comes into being around the 5th or the 6th Islamic century, and it continues to the present day. Most of the ulama legitimize this terminology. The naqliya sciences are the sciences of revelation. Naql means transmission, that which has been handed down to us from an infallible prophet. So, a classical differentiation that you will find in, say, the madrassahs of Mughal India and in the Ottoman Empire is to list 9 ulum under the ulum naqliya. First of all, the sciences of Qur'an, particularly memorization and recitation, the qira'ah and hifz. Generally the first topic to be dealt with by small children. Secondly, the meaning of the Qur'an, the interpretation, the tafsir. That's number 2. Number 3 is hadith and its sciences. Number 4 is fiqh. Number 5 is ilm al-kalam. Number 6 is nahu and sarf, Arabic grammar and morphology. Number 7, other linguistic sciences, prosody and rhetoric. Number 8, literature, adab, very important in the cultivation of the well-rounded Islamic personality. And number 9, Sufism. That's certainly for the Ottomans the basic way in which they subdivided the ulum naqliya. Under the ulum aqliya, we find in the Ottoman Empire and for the Mughals, and also for lesser Islamic polities such as the Uzbek Khanate. Number 1 under the aqliya sciences was philosophy or falsafa. Number 2, geometry. Number 3, astronomy. Number 4, medicine, which included as subcategories botany and biology. Number 5, chemistry. 6 was mathematics. Number 7 was physics. Now that differentiation has no revealed justification, but it was a subdivision that was found useful by the ulama of the later Islamic period, and in those parts of the Islamic world where some semblance of a traditional Islamic education is still available, that's as likely as not the kind of curriculum that you will encounter. What I want to do now, before we break for dinner, is to look in rather more detail at the social context which the Ummah has devised for this process of education. If the religion itself is education, what are the institutions, the frameworks, the methodologies, the social contexts, the attitudes towards learning and the learned that classical Islam has historically favoured? Well, the paradigm is, of course, the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam himself, from the first word iqra, which suggests that he was to recite, in other words, not just to be taught, but to be a teacher of others. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam has been the great educator and hence the first teacher and the first model for Islamic educators. What he did in the house of al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam near Safa in Mecca was to teach. That was the first madrassah of Islam. In Medina, the center of education was the mosque and particularly the Sufa. And we can say that the most important features of classical Islamic education and institutions and attitudes can be traced back, in most cases, to the usages of the Sufa, the veranda, to the south of the house of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam in Medina. And again, if by any mischance you haven't yet forked out your several dollars for your copy of this Fath al-Bari translation, there is a footnote which you'll find on page 37, which talks a bit about these Ahl al-Sufa, spiritual elite amongst the Sahaba. A number of sound hadith speak about them. And one of the early ulama who talked about the Ahl al-Sufa and what the Sufa means as a kind of first university of Islam was Imam al-Hakim al-Nizaburi, who many of you will know as one of the great hadith compilers of early Islam, author of the great Kitab al-Mustadrak ala Sahihain, in which he lists all of the hadiths which meet the conditions for authenticity set by Bukhari and Muslim, but which were not included by them in their collections. And he has a number of other introductory works on hadith. But when he talks about these hadith of the Sufa, Imam al-Hakim indicates what was the view of the early hadith scholars on the function of this academic institution. So he writes, I have pondered these hadiths concerning the people of the Sufa, and I have found them to be among the greatest of the Sahaba in scrupulousness, in wara, and tawakkul, and in constant service of Allah and His Messenger. For them, Allah chose what He chose for His Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by way of poverty, neediness, and humbleness in worship of Allah and leaving the dunya to its people. They are the group to which the Sufis belong generation after generation, so that whoever follows their sunnah and their patient endurance of renouncing the things of this world and their familiar intimacy with poverty and their refusal to beg are in every age the followers of the Ahl Sufa and the people of reliance upon their Creator. Obviously, as a good grammarian, Imam al-Hakim couldn't accept the spurious etymology of the word Sufi from Sufa. Sometimes it's said that the word Sufism actually comes from the Sufa, but any basic knowledge of Arabic morphology will tell you that that's not the case, and early Arab users of the language would never have devised such an etymology. But for Imam al-Hakim, as one of the great hadith scholars, certainly the Sufa are the early paradigm, the authenticating paradigm for the discipline of Sufism, because of their gathering together in one place, because their institution is an institution of learning, because of their proximity to a holy teacher, and because of their awareness of the baseness of the dunya in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There were perhaps 70 of the Ahl Sufa, according to some estimations as many as 300, but we have lists of about 70. So that, if you like, is the first educational institution of Islam, Islam in its developed form. These people were not just taught fiqh and the ahkam, but they were also transformed by the presence of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam. So from the very outset of education in Islam, we may say that Islam sought to cultivate the entire human being. The fiqh, which is for the body, and the tasawwuf, which is for the soul. One without the other leaves a human being partial, lopsided. Now, after the death of the Mustafa, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, a number of the Sahaba continued the traditions of the Ahl Sufa, teaching in the mosque, and the mosque itself becomes university, if we have to use a modern term. And the great teachers were people like Aisha, Ibn Omar, Zayd bin Thabit, radiallahu anhum, and a number of others. These were the people amongst the Sahaba whose proximity to the Rasul, those three people in particular, had qualified them to pass down the ilm, which was the meaning of the Qur'an, and correct fatwas concerning the proper application of the Sunnah. So that's the beginning of education in Islam, and we can say that the very early traditions have been maintained today. Not so much in the Western-style universities in the Islamic world, which, depressingly enough, have believed that one can adopt the form of Western education without importing also much of its ethos and its content. Islam is not best taught to people sitting on chairs with desks separating them physically and hence symbolically from the teacher. Islam is not best taught through a system of examinations, 2 or 3 weeks after which everybody has forgotten everything they knew. Islam is not best taught through institutions with cumbrous bureaucracies, with degree certificates. Islam is not best taught with blackboards, overhead projectors, and the other accoutrements of a modern university, although most modern Islamic universities seem to think that this is just fine. Another measure of our decadence. Traditional Islam is taught according to the Sunnah. It's no good teaching the Sunnah if you're not teaching with the Sunnah. People have to be actualizing what they are learning. So in that early period, we see the classical pattern of Islamic learning unfolding, namely that it is a human transaction, that the religious integrity of the teacher is all important, that the teacher must have received knowledge himself or herself from a teacher, that it is without precedent in Islamic education for a teacher simply to have educated himself or herself from a book, to be an autodidact, and then to hold forth to students. That's not how Islam is, because Islam is about the transmission, not just about of form, but also of content. The student must be transformed not just by the words of the teacher, but also by his ahwal, his aqwal and also his ahwal. The teacher himself must exemplify the knowledge. And this is something that is very remote from the modern Western conception, where the idea of the teacher as a morally or spiritually superior person has almost been lost sight of completely. Now, what actually took place in the primordial University of Islam, which was the Haram in Medina, was fairly free in its form and content. Classical Islamic education is, by modern standards, remarkably relaxed, open-ended, informal, although certainly a dignity and a reverence exists between the teacher and pupil. Nonetheless, in terms of organisation, structuring, timetabling, things are much more informal than is the case in the very interestingly regimented educational environment of the modern West. We do have some information about how classes were allocated. We know that Sayyidina Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, one of the great early educators of Islam, a great expert on the Qur'an, used to divide his time day by day, so that one day would be for a particular subject, after which he would switch to another subject. And he had a kind of rota. So one day he would speak on tafsir, the next day he would speak on fiqh, the next day he would speak on futuh, which means seerah and the early history of the Ummah. The next day would be on poetry and literature, and then he would start again. That was quite a common pattern. The actual timing of the lectures, something which in the most traditional circles has continued to this day. It was assumed that the mind was at its most retentive in the morning. And so most Muslim institutions historically have functioned from dawn until midday. We find this in the life of Imam al-Ghazali, in the Madrassahs in his time. In al-Azhar University today, teaching tends to be in the morning. We know as early as the time of Al-Hasan al-Basri that he would teach from dawn till midday, and it's sometimes said that he is the one who instituted this tradition in the Ummah. We know also a little bit later that Imam al-Shafi'i would begin after Fajr every day teaching Qur'an, after which he would teach hadith, and then grammar, and then poetry, until the noon prayer came. Another recurrent feature of classical Islamic education was that it didn't cost anything. Another surprising fact to those of us used to exorbitant college fees nowadays. Mosque education was purely voluntary and was free. This was regarded as one of the duties of the ulama that they would teach. They wouldn't expect any reimbursement for their services. And where the institution insisted that they accepted, they would frequently give the money discreetly to the poor. Or like Imam Ibn Abbad al-Rundi, the great professor of the Qarawiyyin in Fez, when he died and they lifted up his pillow, they found all of the money that he had been paid, and with a message that it was to be given for a particular waqf for the benefit of the students and for construction to benefit them. In the fullness of time, the tradition of teaching in the mosques became somewhat cumbrous and unwieldy because the number of students increased so greatly. Particularly when Islamic cities became enormous and the desire for knowledge became so widespread that you would have quite commonly, for instance, in the hadith classes of al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, over 10,000 students attending a single class, with mu'eeds, people repeating the words of the Shaykh so that the people in the back rows could hear. Remember, this is before the advent of microphones. It became somewhat unwieldy to have the mosques absolutely packed with people studying. And in the Central Islamic lands, the institution of the Madrassah developed, around about the 5th century of Islam. Madrassah also, of course, was a mosque. You could go there and pray. The 5 daily prayers were established there, but it was understood that the primary function of the madrassah was the inculcation of the ulum, perhaps a particular type of ilm. Some madrassahs will specialize in particular madahib or particular Islamic disciplines. It would be the institution of the Dar al-Hadith, for instance. The name is self-explanatory. Sometimes also the mosques would remain as masjid jami', but would also remain as university mosques, in which case separate teaching halls would be established. Al-Azhar mosque in Cairo, an obvious example of this. Large halls, the rawaqs, were established over the centuries, built adjacent to the main teaching hall, so that the teaching wouldn't get in the way of people who just wanted to go in to read the Qur'an or to pray outside the times of prayer. We also find around this time, the 4th and the 5th century of Islam, that a separation of function takes place with regard to primary education. Typically in medieval Islam and in traditional communities to the present day, small children from the age of about 7 to 10 would attend a very elementary school, usually known as the maktab, where the focus would be entirely on the memorizing of the Quranic text. Perhaps they would memorize in the last year there a few other texts, basic muton, versified summaries of fundamental Islamic disciplines. And then from the age of 10 to about the age of 13, depending on the period and the geographical area, they would go to another slightly more developed institution, usually known as the Kuttab, where these mutun would be diversified. They would learn a lot more of them, and they would begin to learn commentaries on the mutun as well. Another thing that happens in the 4th and 5th centuries is that you find the construction of really enormous madrassas, not just small corners for the inculcation of a particular discipline, but large, often quite showy monuments to the religious piety of a particular ruler, which would include the teaching, say, of all 4 madhabs. So the so-called cruciform madrasa, which becomes very widespread indeed, begins at this period, namely a madrasa that has 4 main iwans or arches, each of which and the attendant rooms would be dedicated to the instruction of one of the 4 canonical madahib. Sometimes also you find that madrasas develop not next to mosques but next to tombs. The tomb of Imam Abu Hanifa in Baghdad was always a great magnet for ulama and for teachers and students. I believe it continues in reduced circumstances to this day. This is the so-called Mashhad Madrasa in Baghdad. Medieval Islam particularly, obviously for the Hanafi and Maturidi ulama, one of the great magnets for scholars. Interestingly, this madrasa system, because of its success, becomes the model for what is known as the studia, the medieval colleges in Europe, when for the first time education started to happen outside the walls of the monasteries. The model that was adopted was the Islamic model. If you read a book by George Makdisi called The Rise of Colleges, he explains very clearly how the Western University as it exists today has a pedigree stretching right back to the medieval Seljuk madrasas of the Near East. Teaching didn't just go on in mosques and in madrasas. However, there are a number of other contexts developed by Islamic civilization in which one could get an education. One of these was a place known as the Ribat. A Ribat is a kind of residential jihad college where the principal duty of those residing, the young men who had spent some years of their life residing in this fortress on the frontier, would be to guard the frontier against the Byzantines, the pagan Turks, the Spanish, or the Vikings, or whoever. And if you ever visit Spain, one of the interesting things you can do is to visit an archaeological site quite close to Alicante, which has recently been excavated and which turns out to be an Umayyad ribat, very early, from the Umayyad Caliphate. Remember, the Umayyads last a lot longer in Spain than they do elsewhere. It's from the time of Abdurrahman III. And the archaeologists, I think Spanish and German, who have unearthed this fairly large complex, which is on the sand dunes next to the sea, were amazed to discover that every one of the rooms where the students would live had its own little mihrab. There was a large space where obviously some form of military training would take place, presumably archery would go on there, fencing and the other Islamic arts of war. But the students were clearly required or expected also to be, or bade to be worshippers, to the extent that each one of their rooms had its own little mihrab, and you can still clearly see them after 1,000 years today. So the ribat is an important place for worship and for learning the arts of jihad, but in these places also you could be educated, because you weren't training to be a soldier, you weren't fighting physically at the front line all the time. You would use the rest of your time studying. Some of the great hadith scholars would seek out the barakah of the thughur, the frontiers, by spending time with these young men at the frontiers and instructing them. Another institution that developed, variously known as the Khan or the Riwaq, very important particularly in the Mamluk period, some of the greatest of our ulama emerged from these establishments, were places that were primarily established as halls of residence. This is the meaning of the Riwaq. There were some 30 at al-Azhar alone. Often at those international universities where a plurality of Muslim nationalities were represented, you would find that although the teaching was given indifferently in the mosque to the members of the different nationalities, all in Arabic of course, nonetheless the different nationalities, the Moroccans, the Palestinians, the Turks, the Tatars, the Swahili, Africans and the rest, would have their own institutions near the mosque, each of which would be under the direction of a sheikh. So a hall of residence was itself a kind of madrasa, a rather austere, almost monastic setting in which a sheikh would preside, usually a sheikh from that nationality. If they were from northern Nigeria, he would be a Fulani or a Hausa or a Bornawi or whatever, so as to understand the culture of the students that he was supervising and to be a bridge between them and the Arabic culture of the institution. Similarly, if he was from Tatarstan or from Bosnia or wherever, he would be from those areas. And his responsibility would be pastoral, making sure that the students weren't getting into moral trouble. He would make sure that they were financially stable and that they were getting the grant to which they were entitled. And he would also make sure that they were filling their spare time not with futility but with useful learning. So learning would take place not just in the mosque or in the madrasa but also in the halls of residence. Another place where you could learn in classical Islam was the library. Quite often the libraries of the medieval Islamic world, which were by far the largest libraries in the world, had their own lecture halls attached, where visiting scholars would be invited to give lectures, where discussions would take place, the equivalent of a modern seminar situation. Sometimes disputes would take place. And the library, nowadays almost completely neglected as a centre for Islamic education in the sense of public instruction, was hugely important for medieval Muslims. Now the context was the Maristan, or the hospital. Hospitals were not just places for curing the sick, usually free of charge, but also provided facilities for teaching. Not just teaching medicine, but for teaching those sciences that were regarded as being indispensable for the well-rounded healing of patients. So that, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire, one of the most important disciplines taught in these institutions was music therapy. We tend to think of music therapy as a modern Western invention. Very important now in hospitals in England, probably in this country as well, because it's established that certain forms of instrumental music can have a healing effect on certain mental diseases. It's a well-known fact. And the Ottomans also knew this, and so did the medieval Persians and the Uzbeks. So if you visit one of the greatest of all Islamic educational complexes, which is the Kulliyah of Sultan Bayezid, late 15th century, just south of the Bulgarian border, one of the most beautiful of all Ottoman structures, you will see the classical features of an Ottoman Muslim university: halls of residence, soup kitchen, the teaching hall, the mosque at the centre of everything, the library. But you will also see this Sama'khana, or this place where instruction would be given in the use of music therapy, and where the mentally ill would be brought to hear certain types of music. Certain modes would be played to them after the physician would recite the nature of the patient's illness. And that itself was sophisticated science requiring its own education institution. So hospitals also partook in the big enterprise of Islamic education. Another important place where you could receive an education in classical Islam was the Khanaqah, an institution dating largely from the Seljuk period, 4th or the 5th century, associated with people like Imam al-Juwayni and Imam al-Ghazali. The Khanaqah was primarily established as a centre for esoteric instruction, for the cultivation of the Sufi disciplines of the Sharia. Very often they would be under the jurisdiction of a particular tariqah, or a particular sheikh, or a particular family. But the Khanaqahs, because of the importance of Sufism in society at large, were also places for the inculcation of exoteric sciences as well. The sheikh of the Khanaqah might well be revered primarily as the possessor of a particular initiatic lineage, a silsila, but he would, as often as not, also be a great exoteric scholar in his own right. Imam al-Ghazali, in his declining years, taught at precisely such an institution, one that he himself established in Turs. And Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani spent the 20 most productive years of his life teaching at the Khanaqah, the Sufi lodge of Sultan Baybars in Cairo. So the image that's very widespread amongst Muslims, which is that education took place primarily in the mosque and the madrasa, really is an oversimplification. Education was so important that it took place in just about every institution that the society had. It took place, to be sure, in the mosques and in the madrassahs, but also in the libraries, also in halls of residence, also in the hospitals, also in these ribats, these military fortresses, and also in the Sufi khanaqahs. Techniques of teaching. These were intricate, but certain standard conventions that came to be accepted amongst the ulama can be identified, and perhaps the most significant of these is the ijaza system. I mentioned earlier that Islamic knowledge, because it's about the transformation of human beings, has to be handed on by a living human being to a living human being. So that the hadith scholars will say that if you cite a hadith in the creation of a fatwa or in the exercise of ijtihad simply as a hadith that you found in a book, that's not valid. That's what they call wijada. Finding a hadith in a book, even if it comes with an isnad, is really not acceptable. Nowadays, a lot of fatwas seem to come with those conditions attached, but for classical Islam, that's a shoddy and a makeshift and a dangerous way of delivering a fatwa. The hadith that is truly known and that can be used by the scholar is the hadith that has been inculcated through sama', through hearing it from a living shaykh and being given permission to teach that hadith by that living shaykh, who is himself in turn authorized by other shuyukh, going right back to the Mustafa salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayh. And this is a difficult condition, but for classical Islam it's absolutely indispensable. No one could teach unless they were qualified. There was no examination system, by and large. A bunch of students sitting down in a large drafty hall and ransacking their memories. That would be regarded as an extremely crude method of testing ability by a much more sophisticated academic world of classical Islam. Instead, you could teach when you were authorized to teach by someone who was himself a teacher and really knew you. So the Shaykh would, when you had read back his book to him and demonstrated adequate knowledge of it, would write in the flyleaf of the book that I give this ijazah to Shaykh so-and-so to teach this book. And this was an excellent means of securing the Ummah from error, because physical text of books are subject to all kinds of scribal errors, nowadays misprints. Whereas the oral tradition, when you hear a text from somebody, you know how everything is pronounced, you exercise your powers of memory to memorize it, is far more effective, far less likely to go astray. And this is absolutely axiomatic. The traditional Islamic education really doesn't use books very much. It's primarily an oral tradition based on the nowadays largely neglected science of memorization. There were degrees of being a scholar. The beginner was known as a talib, seeker of knowledge. Next there would be the mu'ayyid, who would be authorized, because of his teacher's trust in him, to repeat what the teacher was saying to people in the back rows. Then there would be the mulazim, the better student, the more experienced student, would keep the company of the Shaykh constantly and would be, as it were, designated as the Shaykh's successor should the Shaykh be ill or should the Shaykh die. And finally one would become the Shaykh. Those were the 4 stages through which everybody had to pass in the classical Islamic system. Should we stop at this point? Alhamdulillah, we have other things now waiting for us. Thank you for your patience, and inshallah I will see you again tomorrow. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi ta'ala rabbil alameen.